In this video, I'm going to be drawing a scene from the movie Kiki's Delivery Service. It's my first time drawing such a detailed scene from any Studio Ghibli movie, so I thought that we could go through the process together because there's always a lot to learn from other artists. So for this, I'm just going to use Procreate on an Apple iPad Pro because that's what I always use. And I'm also going to be using mostly Procreate default brushes because there are plenty of great options already on there for free. So this is the scene that I have decided to draw. I've often seen other artists online redraw those beautiful scenes of Kiki either in the greenhouse or in the bakery, so I really wanted to try something a little bit different that I haven't seen so many people redraw before. I really liked this scene in particular because of the buildings, and it does also have a little bit of greenery in there too, which feels like a classic Hayao Miyazaki scene. I've already done a super rough sketch of this scene just to get the positioning of everything down, but I've also split it up into 3 sections to keep things really simple. So we have in the foreground Kiki and Gigi on the broomstick, then in the middle ground you have the trees, and in the background you have the buildings. I'm gonna take each bit at a time, so hopefully this will make the drawing a little less overwhelming. My first step for pretty much any illustration is the line art. I begin by lowering the opacity of the sketch, and I'm going to be using the Procreate default brush Peppermint to create the line art. I pretty much always start with the face and then work my way outwards from there, and I like to use long and controlled strokes, and sometimes I also go over the lines to make them a little bit thicker on the outer edges or in places where 2 objects are overlapping. I really like the fuzzy texture of the peppermint brush, but it can be a little bit transparent at times, so it's nice to go over it in a few places just to make it stand out a bit more. Once the face is done, I start working on her body, clothes, and accessories. Although I've drawn her face and hair in my own stylized way, I am constantly referring to the original art piece, especially for the pose and the flow of her dress. One thing that I really like about Studio Ghibli is its shape language, especially for the characters. There's a lot of curved edges. I think it looks very beautiful and dynamic, especially in clothes. Now that Kiki is all done, I am going to work on the line art for the trees, so I begin by making the sketch visible. Studio Ghibli trees are very beautifully drawn and are definitely in a class of their own. As much as I would love to be able to draw trees like this, I don't quite think I have the patience for it. So I have my own method for drawing trees, which I'm going to use here, and it is undoubtedly less beautiful, but it does the job nonetheless. I like to think of trees as made up of lots of different clumps of leaves, which I suppose they are. Duh. These lumps are kind of star-shaped, but are usually open-ended on one side. And I just keep repeating this clump shape over and over again until I have an outline of what looks like a tree. I would definitely recommend this method if you are like me and easily overwhelmed by drawing plants and foliage in particular. And now I just repeat this exact same thing on the other side with the tiny tree sticking out in the corner. Now it's time for the big boss, the buildings in the background. At first glance, this looks pretty overwhelming, but it isn't too bad if you break it down into smaller chunks. To make things even easier, I'm also going to switch on a drawing assist. You may think it's cheating, but I think it is just preserving time and mental energy. It just makes life a whole lot simpler when you're drawing a lot of straight lines in Procreate, so that is what I'm going to do. Using the original art piece as a reference, I'm going to start by drawing all of the straight lines that I see first. And there's quite a lot of them in this piece. If I know that some shapes are going to be replicated, I draw them on a separate layer and duplicate them instead of drawing them out multiple times. For example, I do that on one of the ladders and also for most of the windows since they are exactly the same shapes, just repeated again and again. There are kind of 2 principles that I'm following while I'm doing the background, and that is 1, if I can simplify the shapes in any way, I will. I will take them down to their most basic forms and put them down on the canvas as they are. And 2, if there are any shapes that can be repeated, repeat them, duplicate them. Don't spend the time redrawing everything by hand when you simply don't have to, especially for the background, which is not the main focus of the illustration. The biggest benefit of working on different layers for each part of the drawing, so keeping a separate layer for Kiki, a separate layer for the trees, and a separate layer for the buildings, is that you can erase any overlapping parts without having to worry about keeping everything all neat and tidy. You can just erase it and it's all good. And this is the finished result for my line art. This is going to be the foundation of all of my color work, so I want it to be as neat and tidy as possible. Because there's a lot of small details going on in the background, you may notice that I have made the line art for Kiki a lot bolder than the line art for the background. This is because she is the main focus and I want your eyes to be drawn to her first. On the original Studio Ghibli piece, it appears that they use line art for Kiki and Gigi, but they don't use any line art in the background, so I also wanted to make sure that I still have this softness in my own piece, even though I bulldozed over the whole thing with line art. Now I am going to move on to the color, and I've already made a little color thumbnail that I'm going to refer to. Instead of matching the colors to the original sauce exactly, I have stylized them a little bit. I've made them a bit warmer, and I have also shifted the hue slightly towards the purple side of things. That's just a personal choice, and if you want to hear more information about how I choose colors, I do already have a tutorial up on my channel about that as well that you can check out at the end of this video. For the colors, I'm going to be using a Studio Pen brush, which is yet another Procreate default brush. I'm going to be color picking from the reference window and just adding the colors in one by one underneath the line art layer, of course starting with Kiki and Gigi first. And this process is as simple as it looks. It's like coloring in a page from a coloring book, and is definitely one of the most therapeutic parts of the process for me. Although it looks quite basic at the moment because the Studio Pen has no texture, we will be adding some more texture later. I also do change the line art color on her face and body a little bit because black line art can look quite heavy, and adding some color brings some life to it. And here's the flat colors for Kiki and Gigi. Now I'm going to start adding the flat colors for the tree just using the same brush. I don't have to stick to the shape of the line art quite as strictly for the trees because they're meant to be kind of unruly and bushy. But with that done, it's starting to look a lot more like the original piece already. For adding the flat color to the background, I do things a little differently because I'm mostly going to be working with uniform shapes, and there is a much faster way to do this rather than drawing everything manually. So I like to use the selection tool set to the rectangle mode and make sure to toggle on the color fill option. This just means that whenever I draw a shape and let go of the pencil, the shape will be filled in with my color of choice. I start with the background shapes first that are further away from the viewer, such as the walls, and I work my way from the bottom up, making sure to add any new shapes on new layers. If there are any shapes that don't work with the rectangle tool, I can just switch to freehand selection tool instead and draw them freehand. As long as the color fill mode is still toggled on, it will fill in the shape with your selected color. Although it can be a lot of work to tackle coloring a background, again, I'm always using the reference photo as a guide and trying to simplify things as much as I can. Similar to when I was drawing the line art, I can duplicate any shapes that are repeated throughout the illustration, such as the windows, just to save time and energy. I use the same process for coloring in the entire background until everything is filled in with a flat color. This part of the process can be a little time consuming, but I usually just stick something on Netflix and things go way faster. And this is the final result with all of the flat colors down. Most of the legwork is done, so now I just have to add some finishing touches. This is where the reference photo comes in really handy because we can use it to see how they have tackled the lighting situation. So where have they placed the shadows and the highlights? As always, I'm starting with Kiki first. Looking at the reference photo, I can see that she has light on her dress, and so I'm adding a lighter purple color using the dry ink brush to represent that. I follow the same procedure for adding the shadows too. It's really fun to study how they do light and shadow in animation. It often takes on quite a simple form, especially in the Studio Ghibli style, and it's kind of treated as a shape in its own right, which I find really interesting. Then I add a little bit of blush to her skin using the Bonobo chalk brush. I often use this brush for gradients because it has a super nice texture that I really like. For the shadows of the skin, I use a multiply layer because I like how it preserves the colors underneath while making them a little bit darker. Looking at the reference photo, I can see that she has quite harsh shadows on her face and body, and that's probably because she's in some kind of harsh sunlight situation. I basically just repeat this process for any object that makes up Kiki and Gigi by observing the reference photo, seeing how they do light and shadow, and adding that into my own piece. I purposefully try to keep it quite simple because that is the Studio Ghibli way. They don't tend to do many complex shadows, especially on characters. So I also want to reflect that in my own piece as well. I do change up the color of her dress and add a little gradient just because I feel like it, but with a few subtle highlights, Kiki is now done. Now for the trees. I start with the highlights first, creating these big clustered shapes in patches of leaves that I would imagine would stick out. Then behind those I add some deeper shadows, and these will mainly be positioned underneath the clusters and between the clusters where they would be blocking out the light. I also deepen the shadows just a little bit further to create some more dimension. And finally, to finish up, I add a slight blue light gradient coming from the bottom left-hand side using a big soft airbrush. And repeat the whole process on the other side for the next tree. It's quite simple, a lot more simple than the Studio Ghibli trees, but it's still effective enough to look like trees. And next, we're gonna work on the part that I am definitely dreading the most, and that is the background. The buildings. I start by creating a multiply layer and select a deep blue purple color because that is the hue that I want the shadows to be. To begin with, I started adding the shadows using the selection tool method, but I must admit I quickly abandoned this because I didn't like how it had lots of sharp edges and no texture. So instead, I just decided to draw them by hand using the ink bleed brush, which is another Procreate default brush. To help with many of the shadows that are made up of straight horizontal or vertical lines, I turn on the drawing assist function again to help out and speed things up when drawing all the shadows manually. Having the original artwork to refer to makes things a lot easier because you don't have to think so creatively about where lighting would be. It's just kind of there laid out for you already, so I'm just looking for where they've added the shadows and applying that to my own drawing. There are certain small details that I like to add, such as textures and gradients onto the walls and fabric. This is definitely the most time-consuming part of the process, and although this video is edited nicely for your convenience, it did take a lot of time and patience to do this, and I definitely didn't complete this in one sitting. Once the shadows are complete, I want to add some brick texture to the walls. I start by selecting the 6B pencil brush and create a new layer with drawing assist toggled on. Something that I noticed when looking at the original piece is that the artist didn't create the brick texture across the entire wall. Instead, they created like little patches of brick texture that start and stop randomly. I think this creates a super nice effect because it doesn't make the walls look too busy, and they're not the main focus of this illustration. Kiki is, so yeah, that's something I noticed that I thought was quite cool. We're almost done now, and the last thing I want to do is add some highlights on a new layer set to overlay blend mode. Again, I'm using the original piece as a reference guide to figure out where exactly to put these highlights. Then, to finish up, I noticed that the skin color in the reference image was a lot paler than the skin color I had chosen for Kiki, so I just changed that up to reflect more the original. And I also thought that the trees could do with some additional spot highlights to add a bit more of an interesting look to them. But that is actually it for all of the rendering. It's all done. For a final finishing touch, I do alter the colors ever so slightly using the curves adjustment tool. But here it is. Here is the finished piece. And this is what it looks like in comparison to the original image. Although you can tell that my art style is a little bit different to the style in the original, I'm still really pleased with how this turned out, and I feel like it still has a very Studio Ghibli feel to it. But I would actually love to know what you think. Do you like the finished result? Did you find the process interesting? I certainly did. I feel like I learned a lot from this process. I definitely want to draw more Studio Ghibli scenes in the future, and it would be cool if you could comment down below any suggestions for me, because it's way too hard to choose. There are so many good movies out there. But anyway, I think I'm gonna wrap this up here. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a brilliant week. Take care. Bye. Oh, like and subscribe also if you liked it. Thanks. Bye.